Hey everybody, this is Russ from Metro Game Core. Today we're going to take a look at the newest version of the MSI Claw. This one shares a lot of components from their previous model, which came out last year with the Lunar Lake Intel processor. So in terms of the controls and the screen, they're exactly the same. But what makes this one different is it's got a new shell, and it's now running with an AMD chipset, the Ryzen Z2 Extreme. It's essentially the same chip that's in the Legion Go 2 and the Xbox Ally X, so some of the top tier handhelds that you can buy right now. And so the big question to me is, how does this one stack up against those other very similar handhelds? Grab your favorite snack and drink, let's go ahead and dive in. Okay, let's start with the specs, and like I mentioned, the CPU is the Ryzen Z2 Extreme. It's got 8 cores and 16 threads, and it has the Radeon 890M internal GPU. As far as RAM, we've got 24 gigabytes of LPDDR5X, and it also comes with 1 terabyte of internal storage. The display is the same as it was in last year's model, 8-inch LCD, 1920 by 1200 resolution, and a variable refresh rate that goes up to 120 Hz. The battery size is also the same as it was last year, a whopping 80 watt-hours, which we'll test throughout this video. In terms of weight, we're looking at 762 grams, or about 1.5 pounds altogether. And this is a pretty decent weight considering the size of the handheld. If we look at the Legion Go S, which is a similar size, same screen size and everything, this one has a 60 watt-hour battery, but is only 9 grams lighter. And so this says to me that the MSI Claw is a relatively lightweight handheld considering that it's got 33% more battery. It's about 50 grams heavier than the Xbox Ally X, which also has an 80 watt-hour battery and a smaller display. But I've mentioned it before, they did a really good job making this one very compact and lightweight for that size battery, so I'm not surprised that this one is lighter than the MSI Claw. And then finally, it's about 100 grams heavier than my Steam Deck OLED, which only has a 50 watt-hour battery inside. As far as connectivity, we've got Wi-Fi 7, Bluetooth 5.4, and it also features 2 USB 4 ports. It's going to ship with Windows 11 that has the Xbox full screen experience embedded into it. In fact, all MSI Claws, even their very first model, now have Xbox full screen support. Other than that, we've also got Hall effect sticks and triggers that are very similar to what they were on their previous models. Now, as far as pricing, this is not cheap. It's $1,150, which surprisingly is actually cheaper than last year's model, but still not a cheap handheld by any stretch of the imagination. As a comparison, the Xbox Ally X, which has a very similar processor, the AI version of the Z2 Extreme, and also 24 gigs of RAM and a terabyte of storage, this one is $150 cheaper. It comes in just under $1,000. On the other side of the spectrum, we've got the Legion Go 2, which has a larger 8.8-inch display that is also OLED and amazing. This thing has the Z2 Extreme as well, but more RAM, 32 gigabytes, and it is quite a bit more expensive. This one is $1,350. And so given the state of everything and its competition, I can see why it's priced here. It's kind of in the middle between the Xbox Ally X and the Legion Go 2. But at the end of the day, $1,150 is a lot of money, and it seems kind of crazy for a handheld PC. I think my biggest takeaway over the past year or so is that none of these prices, once they get to $1,000 or more, seem to be worth it for any handheld PC out there. That's just a lot of money for a device that has a lot of limitations to it just by virtue of its form factor. Even though I own multiple handhelds with this chipset or something similar to it, I have a hard time recommending it in the first place just because last generations, like on the Legion Go S here, the Z1 Extreme, does a pretty darn good job on its own, to the point where this is my daily driver. I tend to play more lightweight games, and this one does just fine, and I got this one on sale for $650, and that's a lot easier to swallow than $1,150. We'll talk about this more near the end of the video, but often these handhelds will go on sale over time, so hopefully that $1,150 is not the final price point that you'll have to pay in the future. They've got 2 different color options. They've got one they're calling Neon Green, and then also the one that I'm reviewing here today is called Polar Tempest, just a white and black color. My understanding is that the only option that we have in North America is the white model, but other regions will have the green one. I think that's kind of a shame. I would like to have a choice between the two. Let's take a look inside of the box, and of note, this was sent over by MSI for review, but it's a loaner unit, so I'll be sending it back to them. Regardless, like with all my videos, all opinions are my own. They're not going to see this ahead of time, and no money was exchanged in any way. One of my favorite things about this thing is the box. I think it's like a really nice looking box altogether. I think they did a really good job in terms of the overall design and making it look fun. Inside the box, there's not a lot going on other than the device and then a power supply. This one is 65 watts, and it is relatively small, about the same size and shape as those from Lenovo. First impressions of the device itself is that it's very angular looking. You can see all these different corners here, and I had my hands on this during CES last month, so I kind of got a taste of it then, but I was still surprised when I took it out of the box. I was like, wow, this thing is very blocky and angular. If we look at the front, you can see it's relatively flat across the top of it, and then it starts to angle down here a little bit, and then it has these steep drop-offs all along the sides. Now, I'm glad that it doesn't have a 90-degree drop, but still, you can definitely feel that cornering as you're holding it. I was expecting this to be relatively uncomfortable as I held it in my hands, but honestly, it's not half bad, at least from the front. I do like the texture that we have here. It's not grippy or anything, it's just more like indented, but I do like the overall look of it, and you can definitely feel the difference in texture on your palm. Now the back's got a lot going on. We've got this textured plastic on this side and then a different plastic here. It kind of feels like the standard Steam Deck plastic, and honestly I don't mind that. I think it feels pretty good. And then you can see we've got all sorts of angles around here too. And I gotta say, I don't find this to be very comfortable or ergonomic, at least here on the back. You can see that we have some grips and they do stick out maybe an inch or so, but it's not enough to actually fully grip. You can see that there's a lot of space right here as opposed to something like the Steam Deck, which really fits in the hands nicely. And so it does have some grips, but they do feel kind of small as well as just kind of squarish too. Looking at it from this angle, you can see just how kind of straight down it is. And that's a lot like it was with the original MSI Claw. The second one that they released last year had a more flat ergonomic to it. And it's kind of weird that they went back to that original MSI 1 Claw design overall. There are some comfortable aspects to it, like this middle finger contour. That does feel pretty good, but it's really down here that I don't really like, just in the sense that it's kind of weird place to angle for my pinky and middle finger too. Theoretically, you could just kind of hold them across like this, but that doesn't make a lot of sense to me either because I've just got that wasted space. So I find myself just kind of gripping it on the side like this and never really finding that it's super comfortable. I've had the device for about 2 weeks of testing at this point, and if I had to put a number to the ergonomics, I'd give them like a 6 out of 10. It's not bad. It's not to the point where I've actually actively avoided playing this thing, but I've definitely felt more comfortable controllers, including those from the Legion Go 2 and the Xbox Ally X. My second impression is that I actually like this overall size for a handheld PC. I think that an 8-inch 16:10 screen is one of my favorites. It's the same as in the Legion Go S and why I like it so much. It's also a pretty similar size to the Steam Deck in terms of width and overall heft, and so that's one of the big takeaways I had for this as well, is as soon as I picked it up I was like, oh yeah, kind of feels like the overall size of a Steam Deck in general. So if you're looking to upgrade the 7-inch display and the slower chip on this one to something that's more powerful with a larger display, then you've got it here. Okay, next let's talk about controls, and these are identical to what they were on the previous model, so I'm not going to go too deep into it, but I will give a quick refresher. We'll start with the analog sticks. So these are Hall sensor sticks. They've got a good range of motion to them. They've got RGB lights around them that you can customize, and I do like the grip that they have on the cap here. My only complaint about these sticks is that they feel very light to the touch. They kind of just flick left and right. I don't really mind that personally, but I know a lot of people don't like that. For example, the original ROG Ally also had very light sticks like this, and a lot of people complained and they ended up giving more resistance to their sticks. I don't feel like these have been changed that much at all since the original MSI Claw. So in general, when it comes to using the sticks, I think they're fine. They're not the same as a full-size stick, but they're very close. I just think that they should have a bit more resistance to them overall. I definitely remember this D-pad from last year. It's a hard plastic, kind of glossy, and then it also has a rubber membrane connection to it. It's kind of springy, like I actually think it feels good, but I don't like the actual texture of the Shield style D-pad itself because each of these edges, north, south, east, and west, stick out quite a bit, and it can hurt your thumb over time if you're going to roll across it. Now in terms of a precise input, I think it is pretty good as a rubber membrane D-pad. I'm able to roll it easily. I can also use the diagonals when I want to and avoid them when I don't. And I think for a wide variety of use cases, the D-pad is going to be absolutely fine. My only reservation is going to be with playing Street Fighter style fighting games where you're going to roll it very often, because I did find this fatiguing, much like I did on the previous model too. So in other words, it's going to be a good D-pad for the majority of games you're going to be playing, especially more modern games where you use the D-pad to change out your weapons or something similar to that, and even precision platformers, it does a decent job. It's really those Street Fighter style fighting games that I'm a little bit hesitant in recommending. Okay, next we have the face buttons. So these are rubber membrane and quite clacky. They remind me of an Xbox controller's buttons. They are relatively flat and glossy, but have some curvature to them. And in general, I think they feel pretty good, but they are quite loud, as you can hear. Initially, I was kind of worried about this setup, especially because this B button has the drop off on the sides, but it turns out it's absolutely fine. Like, I've had no issues whatsoever in actually pressing these buttons. And even though there is kind of a steep gradient here, the button works just fine. Beyond that, we've got our select and start buttons here up top, and then we have an MSI claw button, which will bring up their like M center, and then also they have this one, which will bring up their quick menu on the left side. Of note, MSI was the first company to integrate their MSI quick center into the actual Xbox game bar like this, and so I think it's pretty cool. We saw this on last year's model, and I'm glad they have it here today. Also on the front, we've got these two front firing speakers, and this has always been the standout feature of the MSI claw models. They've got really good audio. Let me give you a quick listen right here. These are 2-watt speakers, and I think they sound great. In fact, I would put them above the Steam Deck and the Ally devices, and I think that's saying a lot because those are some of my favorite audio experiences as well. So yes, no complaints about the audio for me. Again, one of the better features of the MSI claw models. We got a lot going on the top of this device, including the power button, which has a fingerprint sensor on it, an LED light, and 2 USB 4 ports. Then we also have this little bit of ventilation for the screen itself, and then other ventilation behind it. Then we have our micro SD card slot, 3.5mm headphone jack, and then volume up and down. One thing I don't mention enough is that I like when the power and volume buttons are on opposite sides of the handheld. The Steam Deck is like this as well. It makes it really handy if you have muscle memory over time because you know exactly where to push your thumb. Now, I have the Legion Go S as my main handheld right now, and they put them right next to each other, and it's super annoying because sometimes I'll try to turn down the volume and I'll accidentally put the device to sleep instead. So I appreciate that they are at opposite ends right here. Finally, up top, we've got our shoulder and trigger buttons. These are very similar to an Xbox controllers. As you can see, the triggers are kind of narrow compared to some of the longer ones that you will find on other devices. And then the bumpers kind of have that same look as well. The bumpers are a little bit loud, but not too bad. And then the triggers are great. I love Xbox controller triggers, and so for me, this is an excellent fit. At first, I was a little bit worried it was going to be too narrow, but I got used to it over about a day or so. And so I've really enjoyed these triggers, probably some of my favorites that I found on a handheld device. They put a little bit of texture on the triggers, which feels great, and then just a tiny bit on the bumpers as well. But yeah, overall, I think the triggers are the star of the show, and the bumpers are nothing to write home about. Moving over to the back here, you can see that we've got this MSI Claw logo, and then our exhaust vents, and then 2 fan intakes as well, and this has been a really good cooling system overall. The absolute hottest I've seen the device get internally has been the high 70s, so it hasn't even reached 80 degrees Celsius, and that is when running it in manual mode, pushed all the way to the max and running a benchmark. So I think in terms of cooling, it is doing its job, and the fan itself is also very, very quiet. In fact, much quieter than other handhelds when pushed this hard. So much like how I think the audio is one of the standout experiences of this device that is better than others, the cooling profile and fan noise are one of the best as well. I will say I like the aesthetics of the overall design here on the back. I like the dragon here and the contrast of the black and white colors and then the angles that we have here too. I'm not a huge fan of gamery looking things, but I think this is pretty tasteful. And then finally on the back, we've got these 2 programmable buttons, and these work pretty well. They don't take a lot of pressure to push down on. And the nice thing is because of their location, it's very easy to ignore them as well in case you don't use them. We actually don't have anything on the bottom at all, so that's really the tour of the entire device. Okay, let's talk about the screen for a bit. It is 1200p resolution, 8 inches in size, and a 16:10 aspect ratio. I think in terms of the coloring and everything else, it is pretty decent, and it does get relatively bright. In general, I usually play it around 65 to 70% brightness, but it can go all the way up to 500 nits. For me, this is too bright when playing indoors, but it does an okay job outdoors. Here I am in direct sunlight, and you can see that the screen is still visible. I'm not sure how often you would want to take this and play it outdoors, but I do think the screen is just enough to be able to play it in sunlight. Another important aspect for me is how dark it can get, and you can see that it gets quite dark to the point where you can't really see what's going on the screen. Even if I turn off the studio lights, you can see it's still very dim. So in general, yes, we've got a good range and brightness, and I generally will play it around 65 or 70%. Okay, let's talk a bit about the software experience on this, just very briefly. Like I mentioned already, this is running the Xbox full screen experience. So right out of the box, it's just going to ask you to log into your Xbox or Microsoft account, and then you'll see all of your games here, but you also have access to opening up Steam or other launchers too. In fact, you can see that across my library here, it's all Steam games, but I can launch them from the Xbox app, which is part of that integration that they brought in with this full screen experience. Now on top of this, they still have their Center M software, so this will launch as well. It does almost the exact same thing where you can navigate through, it'll find your installed titles, and then you can play them from here. For my testing, I just kept it within the Xbox full screen experience, and then I opened up Steam when I needed to, and you can get to that through the game bar here at the top. So if I navigate over by using the bumpers, you can see that right here I can access Steam and then log in and do everything else. The MSI quick settings are relatively bare bones, but they get the job done. So you can turn off your power here, adjust your brightness and volume, and then you can change out your performance modes. There's only 3 here. The AI engine theoretically is supposed to basically throttle and give power when needed to give you the best performance for the battery life, but I found that in general it will usually hover between like 15 and 20 watt TDP. The endurance one will limit your overall TDP and give you longer battery life. It'll do things like turning off the RGB lights on your sticks. But in general, I found that the manual one is probably going to be better if you're going to be playing lightweight stuff, just because this allows you to make deeper adjustments. If you set it to manual, these slider bars will appear and you can adjust it anywhere from 6 or 7 watts all the way up to 35 watts. And like I mentioned before, the AI one will usually cap out at around 20 watts. So this will give you more power if you want it and a lot less if you don't. Beyond that, you've just got a bunch of typical handheld settings that you can do right here. For example, you can turn off your gamepad in case you're going to use an external controller, or you can turn on an FPS limiter, and this will give you something like 30, 45, 60, 90, and then 120. You can also turn on the AMD fluid motion frames and turn on CPU boost. Generally, I leave this one off because it does give you better performance. And then you can also turn on a real-time monitor if you want to see your stats. It's kind of crazy that MSI Afterburner, which is made by the same company, is not embedded into this. I had to install that separately. Instead, this is what it'll look like here. And it does give you some good stats, but I do like the flexibility within MSI Afterburner. And so that's what I used in all my testing. And really, that's about it from the software perspective. I think the Xbox full screen experience still feels a little bit clunky and needs a little bit of work in terms of just making it easier to navigate. Personally, I would rather just use Steam Big Picture like this and then launch directly into that, like I would with most other handhelds that are Windows-based. It is worth noting the Z2 Extreme works really well with custom operating systems like Bazzite, which will give you a SteamOS-like experience as well. So you don't have to be stuck with Windows if you don't want it, if you want to have something that kind of looks and feels like this. I do hope that over time the Xbox full screen experience will get improved to the point where it's a lot nicer to look at and easier to navigate, but for now it gets the job done, but I would rather use something that's more Steam Big Picture mode. Okay, now let's talk about benchmarks before we jump into actual performance testing, and the scores here are exactly as I expected. 4059 in 3D Mark Time Spy, which is almost identical to the Legion Go 2, which has the exact same processor. It's a little ahead of the Xbox Ally X, but still within spitting distance. So again, this is about what I would expect from this particular chipset, no surprises when it came to the benchmarks. What I do like about this chip is that it does well in both low and high powered scenarios. We'll start with the low powered stuff and then work our way up. So with this game right here, a very lightweight title, it runs at 1200p default settings with a 60 frames per second cap, and I can get 6.5 hours of battery life with these particular settings. Now, I manually had to adjust the TDP down to 7 watts. If I didn't, it would go up to 10 watts using the AI engine. And so some of these games, they're very lightweight. It is in your best interest to actually manually turn them down. So my advice would be that if you are going to play a lightweight title like a 2D platformer or something along these lines, something that's not super demanding, I would expect to actually manually turn down the TDP to get the best battery life. What I found is that for the most part, the AI engine settings is going to stop at a 10 watt TDP and won't really go lower than that. And so if you are looking to save as much battery as possible, then you can often manually adjust it to get a better settings. For example, here with Hades 2, 1200p high settings, but I capped it to 60 frames per second. And this allowed me to get a pretty stable overall experience with running it at an 8 watt TDP. It would boost sometimes to 9 watts, but in general, that's about where I was playing it. And I got a little bit over 5 hours of battery life with these particular settings. That's very good. Playing this game on an 8-inch display also looks pretty darn amazing. Once you get to about a 10 watt minimum, that's where I would turn on the AI engine. It does a pretty good job of keeping things relatively stable. So here, playing Megabonk 1200p default settings, I got about 4.5 hours of battery life with this particular wattage. And I would say this is going to be pretty standard for your lighter weight games, where you can expect 4.5 hours of battery life, depending on the settings. For the most part, I would usually set it to a 1200p resolution and then see how it played. And often I would just lock it or cap it to 60 frames per second, but of course you could go higher if you wanted as well. Once you get past those games that are going to run at about a 10 watt TDP graphically, then you're going to see a little bit worse battery life. So here with Absalom, this one requires somewhere around a 13 watt TDP to play at 60 frames per second, and that's going to cut it down to a little bit under 4 hours of gameplay. Similarly, if you want a higher frame rate, that will come at a cost. It's going to require more battery. And so here with Hollow Knight Silksong, this is a game that you can usually get around 6 hours of gameplay if you're going to play it at 60 frames per second. But at 120, it's going to give you a little bit under 4 hours instead. It's really going to come down to how much time you have to play and whether or not you want to have a high refresh rate. Other games that may not be as well optimized, like Slots and Daggers, this one is a surprisingly demanding game. It usually requires about a 15 watt TDP, so this is going to give you a little bit over 3 hours of gameplay time. Once you get to around a 15 watt TDP in the AI engine, you can expect around 3 hours of battery life. A good example is LEGO Star Wars: The Skywalker Saga. Playing this game at 1200p medium settings doesn't give me a stable 60 frames per second, but it still feels nice and smooth, and this has to do with that variable refresh rate screen. As long as we're getting somewhere between like 45 and 60, it feels nice and smooth to me, and so this is how I was playing this game. I thought it was great. And like I mentioned before, the AI engine is going to stop at around a 20 watt TDP, which you can see at the very top of the stats on the top left. So getting to a game like GTA 5, 1200p, a mix of medium to high settings, this will give me a stable 60 frames per second, and this will also cap at around a 19 to 20 watt TDP. And the main thing that you'll see once you get to a 20 watt TDP is that you can expect about 2.5 hours of battery life altogether. Here's another example with Shadow of the Tomb Raider. 1200p high settings gave me a pretty stable 60 frames per second, and again about a 20 watt TDP and a little bit over 2 hours and 15 minutes. And so this is about what I would expect from games that came out about 10 years ago, those that were at the late era of Xbox 360 and PS3. You can play these at a 1200p native resolution and usually high settings or medium settings there and get about 2.5 hours of gameplay. Now, once you get into more modern titles, this is where you have to make some tweaks and compromises. We'll start with Hogwarts Legacy. For this game, I'm still using AI engine, so it's capping out at 20 watt TDP, and you can see the resolution here is 1200p with low settings, but I turned on FSR3 balance, so that's going to reduce the resolution and then upscale it again using AI. So there are some compromises when it comes to the screen fidelity, but on an 8-inch display, it's kind of hard to see. And I also have capped this to a 40 frames per second limit, just to give me a smoother gameplay experience. And so I've been playing this game like this, it's working pretty well. And again, because we're capped at that 20 watt TDP, you can expect about 2.5 hours of battery life. It's very similar with other titles like Marvel Spider-Man, 1200p low settings and then enabling FSR3. This one doesn't have a slider bar in terms of quality, you just basically turn it on or off, and I think it looks acceptable. It's not quite at 1200p, but it does upscale to that using AI, and for me, this is good enough. One more example with these exact same settings is Ghost of Tsushima. 1200p low settings, FSR3 enabled. I'm not turning on frame gen or anything else like that. And you can see that this one is getting an average about 35 to 40 frames per second, which is about what I would expect with this game running at 1200p. Now let's say that you don't want to play this around 35 frames per second. You want it to push a little bit further, maybe closer to 40, 45, or 50. And so we've got a couple options here. We're going to use Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart as our example. This game also has pretty similar performance to those other ones, but what we can do now is go into the manual settings and then crank it all the way up to that 35 watt TDP. But the main thing I've seen is that after 20 watts, you're just going to be putting a lot of power into the CPU without getting a lot of returns. So for example, here with this game, we're getting an average about 35 frames per second at 1200p low settings, FSR3 enabled, but cranking it up to a 35 watt TDP. This is going to significantly reduce the battery life down to about an hour and a half compared to 2.5 hours. If we go back and set it to the AI engine, which will cap at 20 watts, we're going to get a very similar performance profile, about 34, 35 frames per second, but now we're going to save a lot more battery life, about 2.5 hours as opposed to an hour and a half. So just pushing raw power into the device isn't necessarily going to give you those frames that you're looking for. At that point, you're probably going to have to reduce the resolution. So here back in the settings, I'm going to reduce the resolution from 1200p to 800p. Not the ideal situation animation, it's going to make everything look a little bit fuzzier, but I can also turn off FSR3 at this point and just have a straight raster. And playing this game in 800p low settings will give me an average frame rate of somewhere between 50 and 55 frames per second. So this is a big jump in terms of frame rate if this is what you're looking for. You will have a little bit softer graphics overall, but again, if you're looking for smooth gameplay, this might be the better choice. Regardless, the combination of this screen and chipset and battery allows us a lot of flexibility to kind of tailor your experience to what you need. When you start getting into the heavier to play titles, those that will probably do better with a discrete graphics card, this is where you also have to make more considerations. So for example, here with Resident Evil 4, I'm playing this one at 720p low settings, so definitely reduce the resolution right off the bat. And again, with the AI engine, I'm going to cap it at about 20 watts, so we're going to get 2.5 hours of gameplay. But we're getting a pretty stable frame rate, somewhere between 50 and 60 frames per second, and then the variable refresh rate will take care of the rest, so it feels relatively smooth. And then finally, one last example is Returnal. This is a very demanding game graphically, especially for integrated GPUs like on the Z2 Extreme. So here I've set it to 720p low settings, and I'm getting an average about 35 frames per second. Now, this is with FSR disabled. If you wanted to turn that on, it would reduce the overall graphical fidelity, but you can expect somewhere between like 45 and 50 frames per second with those settings. Regardless, I found that at the high end, adjusting the TDP beyond 20 watts does not usually give you a better experience. You can try it out from game to game, but in general, the AI engine is about where I would cap it out anyway, and that will give you somewhere between 2 and 2.5 hours of battery life. Okay, so now that the testing is done, let's start wrapping up and talk about what I like and what I don't like about the MSI Claw A8. Number one is that we've got some decent components inside. It's basically the same as last year's model in terms of the screen and the buttons and the analog sticks. They're all excellent, but I think they could be better, and I'm looking forward to a refresh with their next model. The big standout of this particular model is the Z2 Extreme chipset, and I do like the performance on this device. You can get some great battery with a lower TDP, but also just setting it to the AI engine and just enjoying the game as it is will give you on average 2.5 hours of battery life, and a lot of that has to do with that whopping 80 watt-hour battery. I like that a lot of companies are using 80 watt-hours as a standard with their flagship handhelds because it does remove a lot of the battery anxiety which comes from playing on a handheld. I love the fact that I can just turn on games and fully expect to get about 2.5 hours of gameplay. I also like this screen. 8 inches, 1200p resolution is about perfect for me in playing with a handheld PC. And so, yeah, I love to see this overall screen size, and I hope they use it in the future. The device also has exceptional audio, not just the speakers and the sound from the music as you're playing, but also the fan noise is relatively quiet and stays very cool. Now, of course, the MSI Claw is not perfect, so a few things I didn't like about it. Number one is the sharp angles that we have along the front and the sides, and those grips on the back. It does give the handheld a distinct look, but I think that a more rounded handheld would just feel a lot more comfortable, and so I wish they had gone that route instead. I mentioned a second ago that some of these components probably need a refresh with the next iteration, and I think it's the analog sticks they should focus on the most because they feel very lightweight and kind of flicky. So my hope is that in the next iteration, we've got more resistance to these analog sticks because they feel too lightweight in this one. And then finally, of course, is this high price. $1,150 for any handheld, no matter how good it is a lot to ask for. For me personally, I think that this price point of the Z2 Extreme on this and other models is too high compared to the performance difference that we see between this generation and the previous one, which is a lot cheaper. So putting it all together, you're probably wondering whether or not I recommend the MSI Claw A8, and I think it really comes down to the price point. This is a good handheld. I don't think it does anything wrong. There are some things I wish were a little bit better about it, but in general, I think it's a pretty decent piece of hardware. It just doesn't feel like something that should cost $1,150. To me, it feels more like an $800 handheld. So in the future, if it does go for sale around that price point, then I think that, yeah, it's going to be a pretty good deal. But until then, like with other devices of this generation, I think the Z2 Extreme is just too expensive right now. So the way I see it, this is good hardware that doesn't really fit the price point that I'm expecting from this overall experience over the past couple weeks. I'd pay $800 for a handheld like this, but I wouldn't pay $1,150. And so if you're able to find it either on sale or an open box version, then sure, I think this might be a good handheld, but I think it's one that might get better in the future if and when the prices go down. Let me know what you think in the comments down below. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.